Hi, fifth graders. It's Mrs. Van and Rudy. We're here to begin reading you a chapter book, which usually doesn't work out really well for me to do at school because we always get our library time interrupted. And we try to read a chapter book. Sometimes it's 3 weeks before we can read it again. So we're going to do this one until the end of the school year, okay? The book that we're going to read, it's backwards, I know, is called Guest by Mary Downing Hahn. And she is the author who wrote The Girl in the Locked Room. So I thought this would be a really good one for my fifth graders, okay? I hope you guys are doing really well. Rudy and I have been hanging out here in our house. This is my living room. We're joined by Rudy's brother, Cody. You can see Cody down there. Cody! That's Cody. And he's going to lay here and listen to our story. So Rudy and I are going to begin our story called Guest by Mary Downing Hahn. We're going to read 2 chapters every week. There's 14 chapters. So if you can do your math, that's 14 divided by 2, which is 7. So it's going to take us 7 weeks, which is about the end of the school year, to finish this book. Okay, so I'm excited to read to you. I have not read it yet, so I'm going to be going along with you. I've taken a look at it, but I kind of wanted to be surprised like you guys are. Okay, so I'm going to get Rudy a little bit more in focus because I know he's more important than I am to you guys. And he's going to lay here and read with me. And we're going to read Guest. I was in a temper fit to blow the lid off a kettle of boiling water. And who wouldn't be? Since sunup, I'd been doing chores. I'd milked the cow, hauled 2 buckets of water from the well, fed the chickens, and then fought the hens for their eggs. Now I was down on my knees, sweat-soaked and bug-bitten, yanking weeds from the vegetable patch. My hands were caked with mud, and my nose was burned as red as a strawberry. Midges hummed around my face and bit my ears. Wiping the sweat from my eyes, I yanked a thistle out by its roots, only to see 2 more hiding in the beans. I scowled at my baby brother Thomas, who lay nearby on the grass. You, I muttered. If it weren't for you, I'd be down the lane skipping rope with the village girls. But oh no, I must watch you and do chores as if I were a servant. You've ruined my life. That's what you've done. It's a wicked thing to say, but sometimes I wish you'd never been born. Thomas smiled at me and cooed as if I'd praised him. Ashamed, I clapped my hand over my mouth and hoped Ma'am hadn't heard me. But she was in the cottage, singing at her loom, weaving soft blankets to keep Thomas warm when winter came. I watched Thomas playing with his toes and chuckling to himself. Truth to tell, he was a sweet baby. I'd be lying if I said he wasn't. He never fussed, never cried. He ate what he was fed and slept the whole night through. And he was beautiful, even though no one said so. When visitors came, they leaned over the cradle and frowned and scowled and shook their heads. "'Tis a pity he's so ugly and puny," they'd say. "Oh, yes, he's a sickly one. He'll not live past his first year. And such a nasty temper he's got. No good will come of him. If I caught a fish half as ugly as that poor baby, I'd throw it back." It was as if each visitor tried to come up with a worse insult than the one before. And all the while, Ma'am and Daddo and I smiled and nodded in agreement. For all of us, even the youngest, knew it was bad luck to compliment a baby. Since the day my brother was born, I'd been warned not to speak of his pretty curls or his blue eyes or his dimples. I mustn't boast of his sweet nature or praise him in any way. It was the kind folk we feared. That's kind with an E on the end, and folk with an E on the end. Although no one in our village had seen them for many a year, they could be far away or just outside the cottage door. They were sly and full of tricks, and no matter what we called them, they were far from kind. though no one ever dared say that aloud either. If we spoke of them at all, it was to say they were wise, they were beautiful, they were brave and noble and honest in their dealings. When in truth, if we offended them, they burned our barns and cottages, stole our livestock, sent plagues to sicken us, cursed our fields with thistles, lamed our horses, and dried up our cows' milk. Worst of all, if the kind folk learned of a beautiful baby boy's birth, they'd steal him away and leave one of their own sickly creatures in his place. And what misery the changeling would bring to its new mother. As if it weren't bad enough that her own sweet baby was gone, changeling screamed and cried and bit and pinched and broke things. She'd have no rest, that poor mother, no joy. And so we did our best to keep Thomas safe. I watched him while Mam did her housework, and she and Dado watched him at night. We never even whispered sweet things to him for fear the kind folk would come for him. Their spies were everywhere. Long-eared rabbits listened in the hedges, and sharp-eyed crows watched from chimney tops. Toads in ponds, fish in streams, foxes slinking by, any and all might carry message to the kind folk. I stabbed my trowel into the dirt and dug out a stubborn thistle. I shouldn't have spoken so crossly to Thomas. He was too young to understand my words, but he must have heard the anger in my voice. A crow cawed, and I looked up to see him perched in a tree over my head. He ruffled his black wings and stared down at me. His dark eye reflected a sliver of light. Keeping watch on me, he cawed again. It sounded as if he were laughing at me. Suddenly anxious, I glanced at Thomas. He'd just learned to sit up, and he was looking at me to make sure I'd noticed. The small chain he always wore around his neck lay in the grass. Its silver locket sparkled in the sunlight. Dropping the trowel, I ran to fetch the locket. Old Granny Hedgepath gave you this, Thomas. You're not to take it off. You'd best do what that old witch says, or she'll eat you for dinner. Thomas laughed and clapped his hands. What did he know of witches and their ways? I tried to slip the necklace over his head, but he grabbed the chain and held it out for me to take. Giving things to people was his new game. Most people, including me, gave them back, but Matthew down the lane had run home with the wooden cow Dado had carved for Thomas. I'd gone to his house and asked him for it. Babby gave it to me, Matthew wailed. Luckily for Thomas, but not for Matthew, his mam snatched the toy cow and handed it to me and gave Matthew a smack. I took the chain from Thomas and smiled. Without thinking, I said, Oh, Thomas, you're so sweet. How could I ever be vexed with you? You're the best baby in the world, and the prettiest. And when I tried again to slip the chain over his head, he ducked away laughing. I held the necklace out, but instead of continuing the struggle, I sat in the grass and admired the necklace. The silver chain was finely made, and the heart-shaped locket was decorated all over with a cunning pattern of vines and flowers. I sighed. It was much too pretty to waste on a boy. In truth, I'd wanted the locket from the day Granny Hedgepath fastened the chain around my brother's neck. Make sure Thomas wears this always, she told Mam. Never remove it. He must eat and sleep with it around his neck. Even when you bathe him, make sure the locket stays fastened. It will protect him from mischief. Placing her bony hand on Thomas's head, Granny added, May the kind folk of the forest find joy elsewhere and ignore this poor, ugly baby. I was watching Granny from my shadowy corner, neither moving nor speaking. It frightened me to look at her, but she drew my eyes like the evil cockatrice. Her white hair was wild and uncombed. Sticks and leaves poked out of its tangles. She had long yellow fingernails as sharp as hawk's talons, and her eyes were sunken so deep in their sockets I couldn't tell their color. Some said the old woman was a healer. Others said she was a witch. But everyone in the village agreed she knew magic and spells and walked in Mirkwood at midnight. They also knew not to anger her. Suddenly Granny turned to me in my corner. Why are you sulking there, girl? I see your sly eyes. I hear the beat of your jealous heart. The necklace is for your brother. You have no need for it. She spoke as if I were a wicked girl, a bad sister, someone not to be trusted. Even though it was rude, I turned my head away and scowled at the floor. How had Granny guessed I wanted that necklace? It belonged around my neck, not my brother's. After Granny left, Mam said, "You shamed me, Molly. I've taught you to smile and curtsy when you see Granny Hedgepath, but you didn't either. What must she think of you?" After Granny left, I answered, "I don't care what she thinks. Did you not hear what she said to me? She was hateful and rude." "No, it was you who was hateful and rude." Mam looked at me. "I hope you haven't made an enemy of that old woman." "I don't care if I have. I'm not afraid of her." If Mam had had Granny's skill, she'd have known I was indeed scared of the old woman. I knew full well I should have been polite, but my tongue had a way of getting away from me. I said what I thought and didn't think about the consequences until it was too late. Now, far from Granny's prying eyes, I held the necklace up and watched it sparkle in the sunlight. "You want me to wear this, don't you?" asked Thomas. "That's why you gave it to me." He smiled so widely I saw the buds of new teeth pushing up through his pink gums. Surely Thomas wouldn't come to harm if I wore the necklace for just a few moments. With care, I undid the clasp and fastened the chain around my neck. How beautiful it was! I should have given the necklace back to Thomas, but instead, I tucked it inside my dress. I liked the smooth feel of the locket against my skin. And just for a little while, I thought, what harm could come to Thomas with me so near? It seemed at least a dozen thistles had sprouted while my back was turned. Their thorny stems hurt my hands, and their roots held the soil tightly. I tugged and tugged until my back hurt from bending over. If I did much more weeding, I'd be an old woman before I even grew up. I'd hobble around in ragged clothes and end up as crazy as Granny Hedgepath. And while I worked, a large cloud drifted across the sun and plunged the garden into shadow. At the same time, the breeze dropped, and a strange silence fell. No leaves rustled. Chickens stopped clucking and disappeared into their coop. No birds sang. No bees hummed in the clover, and the colors of the flowers and grass, trees and sky faded to gray. Worried, I got to my feet to check on Thomas. Suddenly, the world seemed to spin and lurch. Colors blurred and ran together. I saw two of everything. The sky was beneath me, the grass above me. Too dizzy to stand, I fell to the ground. The last thing I heard was a crow laughing. Chapter 2. When I opened my eyes, I was lying flat on my back in the garden. I got to my feet slowly, lightheaded from the heat and as weak-legged as if I'd run to the top of Cattail Hill and down the other side. The cloud was gone and the sun shone. Hens pecked in the dirt. A robin sang from its perch on a fence post, and bees buzzed. A cool breeze blew through the leaves. The crow had left its perch. My brother was just as I'd left him, sound asleep on the quilt. Bending over him, I tickled the side of his foot, the sole of his foot, to wake him. But instead of laughing and stretching out his arms to be picked up, he began to cry. His face turned an ugly shade of red. His scream sounded more like a cat than a baby, and when I tried to lift him, he kicked and hit me. Pulling the locket out of my dress, I offered it to him, but he screamed at its touch. "Thomas," I cried. "Thomas, it's me, Molly. What's wrong? Why are you crying?" Thomas ignored me and continued to scream and kick. After a struggle, I finally got a grip on the squirming baby and carried him shrieking with rage into the cottage. Ma'am ran to meet us. "Whatever's the matter with Thomas? Is he bee-stung? Spider bit?" When she tried to take him into her arms, he fought her just as he'd fought me. He screeched and howled as if he'd never stop. "Quick, Molly," Ma'am said. "Fill a tub with cool water. He's suffering from the heat." On shaky legs, I ran to the well and drew a pail of water. Ma'am hadn't noticed that Thomas wasn't wearing the necklace. I'd put it around his neck later when he calmed down and no one was looking. While I filled the tub, Ma'am stripped Thomas of his clothing and plunged him into the water. For a moment, the surprise silenced him. Ma'am examined him, but found no sign of sting or bite, and soon he began to scream again. Ma'am wrapped him in a soft blanket and rocked him in her arms. Nothing she did calmed him. If anything, Thomas screamed louder. "Fetch Granny Hedgepath, Molly," Ma'am cried. "Make haste." Full of fear and dread, I ran into the lane, up Cattail Hill and down the other side. Behind me was Thomas, perhaps dead already, and before me was Granny Hedgepath. Only out of love for Thomas would I go to her door and knock. "What do you want, girl?" The old woman's voice was as harsh and as merciless as the crow's. "Can't I have a moment's peace without some fool child hammering at my door?" "Please, Granny, it's Thomas," I said, gasping. "He's screaming like a banshee and won't let Mam or me touch him. Mam sent me to fetch you. Can you please come? He's only a wee baby." "Tush! Most likely it's nothing more than a spider bite or a bee sting." She began to close the door, but I cried, "Mam already looked him over. There's not a mark on him. Thomas never cries. He's the best." "Oh, fie, girl. Shut your mouth. You never know who's listening, do you?" Granny Hedgepath frowned, but she hobbled inside to get her medicine bag. From the open door I saw an old table and a spindly chair. Dried herbs dangled in bunches from the rafters. The rest of the cottage hid in shadows, which seemed unnaturally thick in the corners. Granny stepped outside as quiet as a mouse in a room full of cats. Scowling and muttering to herself, she pinched my arm. Come along. Sam Cloverall's girl. You'll see nothing in my cottage but what I want you to see." I ran beside the old woman to keep up with her long strides. Although I spoke not a word, Granny continued to mumble and mutter. It was clear she disliked me. But what did it matter? I'd come to get her to help for Thomas. Once he was cured, I'd never visit her cottage. Whatever went on inside, I wanted nothing to do with any of it. Long before we reached the gate, we heard Thomas screeching. "It's as if he's become pretend Thomas," I said. "You know how we all say he's awful so they won't—" Granny turned to me, her face fierce with anger. "Hush! Not another word from you, girl." I covered my mouth with my hand to keep from saying something sassy and followed the old woman into her cottage. Pushing Mam aside, Granny bent over Thomas. She poked and she prodded. She looked. She even sniffed. Finally, she straightened up and stared Mam in the eye. "You must be brave and not flinch from what I'm about to tell you, Agnes Cloverall." Mam trembled and her breath came in gasps. "It's brain fever," she moaned. "Our Thomas will be dead before dawn." "'Tis not brain fever. Indeed, 'tis far worse than that." Granny seized Mam's hand and held it tight. "This baby is not Thomas," she said. "They came for yours and left theirs in their place." "No," Mam cried. "Look at him. Of course he's our Thomas. Don't you think I know my own baby?" Granny waved her hand in front of Mam's and my eyes. "Look again, Agnes Cloverall, and tell me what you see in that cradle." Mam and I, stared at the cradle. What lay there was long and scrawny, its face as wrinkled as an old man's and its eyes as yellow as a cat's. Tufts of hair finer than milkweed spores sprouted from his head. He glared at us, kicking his skinny legs, and howled like a wild thing. Never had I seen a creature so ugly. Mam screamed, "No, it cannot be. Oh, let it not be, Granny." I longed to take Mam's hand and comfort her, but I backed away in shame. This was my doing. I'd said what I shouldn't have said. I'd taken his necklace and worn it myself. If Mam learned what I'd done, she'd never forgive me. I pressed my hand to my chest and covered the tiny bump of the locket under my dress. Mam turned to Granny, her eyes wild with fear and rage. "Get this creature out of my house," she cried. "It mustn't sully Thomas's cradle." Granny took Mam's arm and forced her to look at the creature. "It's a hard thing I'm asking you, Agnes Cloverall, but you must keep him. Treat the changeling with kindness. Nurse him, sing to him, rock him as if he were your own sweet Thomas." "Have you lost your wits?" Mam asked. "Nurse that creature? I can't. I won't. If you refuse to do it, I myself will take him to the crossroads tonight and leave him there. They can come for him or not. I want my own child, not this monster." "Be still and listen." Granny's grip on Mam's arm was tightened. If you treat this changeling well, they'll treat Thomas well. But if you treat him badly, you can be sure your own child's life with them will be filled with misery and suffering. If I mistreat this creature, they'll mistreat Thomas. That's their nature. They and theirs come first, even the ones they don't want. We and ours come last. She paused for a moment. If the changeling grows strong and healthy on human milk, they might take him and return yours. Mind you, it doesn't happen often, and I make no promises. There's a chance you'll get your Thomas back, but only if you please them. Ma'am returned her gaze to the cradle. Tears ran down her face. I do this not for you, but for Thomas, she told the changeling, my own true child who's been taken from me. With tears running down her face, she lifted the changeling and opened her dress. He began to nurse at once. The only noise was the sound of him nursing, and loud slurping as greedy as a piglet, and many times uglier. Granny Hedgepath steered me toward the door. Leave your man alone with it, she said. She must have peace and quiet if she's to nurse the changeling. She led me to a stone bench in the garage and sat beside me. Thomas's quilt lay in the grass, rumpled and empty, a pitiful reminder of my little brother. It were you, weren't it? You said what you shouldn't have said. Granny Hedgepath held my arms tightly and forced me to face her. Tell the truth. I'll know if you're lying, you wretched girl. Trembling with fear and guilt, I dared not confess to Granny. I tried to pull away, but the old woman's fingernails bit into my skin, and I whimpered. Answer me! Granny shook me so hard my head bounced, as if the old woman meant to scramble my brains. Careless, stupid girl! You praised Thomas, didn't you? You boasted. You drew their attention. I didn't mean to speak out loud, I cried. The words were supposed to stay in my head, but... The old woman shook me again. I knew it the day I came with the locket and you hid in the shadows, sly as a snake. You were jealous of your brother. You wanted them to take him away. No. I tried to escape the old woman's hold. I love Thomas. Granny Hedgepath shoved her face into mine, so we were nose to nose. Anger danced in her eyes. I see the wickedness in you. I turned my head away from Granny's face. Yes, I'd envy Thomas, but not enough to want the kind folk to take him. No, surely I didn't. I wasn't that sort of sister. If only the old woman would go away. I couldn't bear the strange, earthy, smoky smell of her or the feel of her cloak, coarse and scratchy and old against my skin. Her breath was raspy, and its odor was a mixture of herbs and spices and stale food. Once more I tried to free myself, but she didn't loosen her grip. Suddenly she pulled the locket out of my dress and unfastened it and then held it in front of me. So, you took the locket. I wondered why it hadn't kept the dear babby safe. Thomas gave it to me. He wanted me to have it. It was just for a little while. I meant to give it back, but I began to cry. The old woman was right. I was indeed a bad sister, a horrible sister, the worst sister a baby brother could ever have. I didn't want them to take him. I didn't. She leaned even closer to me and hissed in my ear. How do you like your new baby brother? Is he what you wanted? Without waiting for an answer, Granny Hedgepath hurled the necklace at me and strode toward the gate. Shaking with anger, I shouted after her, Don't you dare call that monster my brother. Granny Hedgepath looked back. Best learn to mind your tongue, or it will forever bring you trouble. With a swirl of her tattered cloak, the old woman strode through the gate and out of sight. Not knowing what else to do, I fastened the chain around my neck and hid the locket again under my dress. I was no longer comforted to feel it against my skin, but I didn't want anyone else to know I had it. A few moments later, Dado came down the lane whistling, his work in the fields done for the day. Usually I ran to meet him. When I was little, he'd hoist me onto his shoulders and carry me home. How tall I'd felt, perched up high. I could see over the green fields all the way to Mirkwood, lying like a dark shadow at the mountain's feet. He'd laugh and say, Shall I take you to Mirkwood and leave you there with the kind folk? No, Dado, no. I'd cling to him, terrified of the dark wood and its mysteries. Never had I gone there, and never would I go. This evening I didn't run to meet Dado. I sat on the bench and dreaded what he'd do when he saw the changeling in the cradle he'd made for Thomas. Dado stopped in front of me. "Why, Molly, what are you doing sitting here all by yourself without a word of greeting?" A loud screeching in the cottage saved me from answering. "Well, that can't be our Thomas," Dado said, wailing like a starving cat. He looked at me as if he expected an answer. In a small voice, I said, "You're right, Dado. It's not our Thomas." I'd spoken too low for Dado to hear. With a puzzled face, he went into the cottage, and I followed slowly. Scooping up the changeling, he looked at Mam. "What's the matter with our Thomas? He looks a bit poorly." Mam began to cry. I turned to Dado to explain, but before I opened my mouth to speak, Dado asked, "Has Granny Hedgepath seen him, Agnes? He looks worse than I first thought." Yes, she's been here and gone," Mam sobbed. "There's nothing she can do." "It must be bad if Granny can't help." Dado held the changeling close and rocked him gently. "Never fear, Thomas. We'll make you well again. There are other healers who know as much or more as Granny Hedgepath." "Sam, are you blind?" Mam cried. "That's not Thomas in your arms." Dado smiled down at the changeling, who stared back with strange white eyes. "Don't be daft," Dado said. "If he's not Thomas, who is he?" He laughed as if Mam were making a joke. I snatched the changeling from Dado and held him in front of his face. "Look at him!" I screamed. "Can't you see this is not Thomas?" Shrieking, the changeling wriggled and fought to escape, but I held him tightly. "They took Thomas today and left this in his place." Dado still did not see the truth. "They?" "They," Mam said. "You know very well who Molly means, Sam. Look at that baby properly." Dado stared into the screaming creature in my arms. His face changed from worry about Thomas's health to horror at what he finally saw. "It cannot be," he whispered. "We've been so careful, Agnes. We've not said a word to draw them to our door." Fearing he'd hurl the changeling at the wall, I took the strange baby from Dado. Shouting to make myself heard above the wailing, I said, "They came with their sickly baby and took our Thomas away with them." Dado groaned and turned away from me. "We cannot keep their wicked creature." "We must," Mam told him. "Granny Hedgepath says if we treat the changeling well, they'll treat Thomas well. If their sickly one thrives, they sometimes bring back the one they took and take their own away with them." "They'll never bring our Thomas back," Dado said. "I'll carry their cast off to the crossroads this very night and leave him there for them to take or not." "No!" Mam took the wailing changeling from me. "We'll do as Granny Hedgepath says. We must, Sam, for Thomas's sake." Dado watched her unfasten her dress and start to nurse the changeling again. "I cannot bear the sight of this," and without another word, he strode out of the cottage. Mam ran to the door and called after him, "Where are you going, Sam?" "To the tavern. There, I'll hear no screaming, yowling brat." "When will you be home?" Mam cried. "Not until you've taken that thing to the crossroads. I'll not sleep under this roof until it's gone." Dado opened the door and nearly ran from the cottage. I put my arms around Mam and pressed my head against her side. Above me, the changeling kicked and squirmed. "Dado will come back," I said, my heart breaking as I spoke. "He will. I know he will." Mam pushed me away. "Leave me be, Molly. I don't need you tugging at me, too." Gone was Mam's rosy face. Gone were her dimples. Gone was her smile. From the worn, sad look of Mam, she might as well have been a changeling herself. Late that night, I lay in my bed in the loft, hoping to hear Dado come home before I fell asleep. But the only sounds were the changeling's wails and shrieks and Mam's weary attempts to rock it to sleep. No footsteps in the lane, no sound at the door, no voice calling out Mam's name. I felt the locket under my nightgown. I'd wear it forever, not because it was pretty, but as a reminder of what I'd done. That's 2 chapters, guys. So I hope you enjoyed the beginning of the book. I think it sounds pretty good. Took me a little longer to read it than I thought, so this is about a half an hour thing. But Rudy and I will be back next week to read a couple more chapters of Guest by Mary Downing Hahn. I hope you guys are doing really well. We miss you so, so much and can't wait to see you again soon, we hope. So Rudy and I, he's been sleeping. We say bye-bye. We love you guys. Take care.